So, what did wealthy people eat in the Middle Ages? Let's just say that if you were rich, your dining table was not about satisfying hunger. It was a stage for showing off. Every meal was a performance, a chance to prove that your purse was deeper, your connection stronger, and your taste far superior to anyone else's. The rarer, bigger, and more extravagant the dish, the more impressive it looked. Before diving into what they ate, let's explore how dining itself became an art form. In those days, a noble feast was not simply a meal. It was a grand event carefully orchestrated to dazzle guests. When a powerful lord invited people to his hall, every dish, every cup, and every decoration screamed wealth and status. Tables groaned under the weight of countless plates, brought out in a precise order. Each round of courses might contain a dozen or more dishes. One famous banquet even featured more than 50 different foods, forcing guests to pace themselves or risk missing the final course. The way food looked mattered just as much as how it tasted. Imagine walking into a great hall and seeing a roasted peacock, its bright feathers carefully reattached to make it appear alive again. Nobles did not just eat the bird, they wanted it to be a showpiece. Or picture a giant pastry that, when sliced open, released live birds fluttering through the hall. It sounds unbelievable, but it actually happened. Medieval cooks were not just chefs. They were artists. Between the main courses, they presented subtleties, edible sculptures made of sugar paste, marzipan, or jelly. These could take the form of castles, mythical creatures, or entire battle scenes. Some were so detailed that they looked more like miniature works of art than food. Every bite was meant to impress. The ingredients chosen for these meals also announced wealth. Anything imported, rare or costly, was a prized addition. Nobles favored oranges, almonds, rice, and spices that came from faraway lands. Some spices were worth more than gold by weight, and using them freely was the ultimate power move. When your pudding cost more than your servant's yearly income, everyone knew you had made it. Fine wines were another mark of luxury. These were often sweetened and infused with spices to create a popular drink called hippocras. Servants continuously refilled cups, ensuring no one's glass stayed empty. At one royal celebration, records claim more than 300 barrels of wine were consumed. Nothing proclaimed success quite like making sure your guests were too intoxicated to remember what happened. The competition among nobles turned dining into an arms race. If your rival served 40 dishes, you had to serve 50. Some banquets were so immense that a single table for the first course stretched over 160 feet. These feasts were not just about indulgence. They served as statements of hierarchy and authority. Every seat was assigned according to rank, and everyone understood the unspoken message. Food was a language of power. Amid all this extravagance, one thing dominated the noble diet more than anything else: meat. While peasants might only eat meat on religious festivals or during special occasions, the rich consumed it daily and in enormous quantities. The philosophy was simple. If it moved, it could be eaten, preferably while others watched. Records reveal staggering amounts of consumption. Some nobles reportedly ate up to 5 pounds of meat each day, which equals about 20 modern burgers. Over the course of 3 months, a wealthy lord could eat roughly his own body weight in animal flesh. One duke was known to devour 6 entire swans during a single 12-day celebration, along with an uncounted number of other creatures. In the end, medieval dining was not about nourishment at all. It was a grand performance, a glittering showcase of privilege and excess, where even the act of eating became a display of dominance. The selection of meats on a noble's table during the Middle Ages went far beyond what most people recognize today. Beef, pork, and chicken were just the basics. The wealthy craved more refined and adventurous game, such as deer, wild boar, and hare. These animals represented more than food. They were powerful symbols of prestige that displayed both hunting ability and land ownership. In large castles, kitchens often employed cooks who specialized entirely in preparing game meats, with their own tools, storage areas, and roasting pits. Hunting rights were tightly controlled, however. Laws strictly protected certain species, particularly deer that roamed in royal forests. The penalties for breaking these hunting rules were terrifyingly harsh, ranging from losing a hand to losing your life. Medieval forest officers were not the type to hand out warnings. They handed out lifelong punishments. For truly special events, nobles demanded the rarest creatures. Swans appeared only at royal banquets, considered far too exclusive for anyone but the highest ranks of society. Peacocks, with their bright feathers restored after roasting, were popular as striking showpieces at banquets. Birds that we now protect, such as herons, cranes, and storks, were once prized delicacies served to the elite. Some castles even kept aviaries, filled with exotic birds to ensure a constant supply of fresh fowl. The strangest meats, however, came from the water. Porpoises and dolphins frequently appeared on aristocratic menus, especially during religious fasting days when eating land animals was forbidden. The church had conveniently labeled these mammals as fish, offering an easy loophole for the devout but hungry. Even beavers made the list. Because they lived in water and had scaly tails, church authorities decided they counted as aquatic creatures, allowing their meat to be eaten on fast days. Cookbooks from the time include recipes recommending roasted beaver tail served with spicy pepper sauce. Many monasteries kept their own beaver ponds to maintain a steady supply during Lent and other fasting periods. Medieval chefs also loved turning meat into art. They would carefully reassemble roasted animals so that they appeared alive again, or even combine parts from different species to create new mythical creatures. One legendary dish known as cockentrice joined the front half of a pig with the back half of a rooster, creating a bizarre hybrid proudly displayed as if it were real. If a scientist had turned to cooking, this would have been his masterpiece. Even on ordinary evenings, noble dinners were extravagant. A single meal often included several different meats, each prepared in a unique style. Some castle records describe banquets with a dozen meat dishes served all at once. Servants could easily gauge their lord's rank by counting the number of meats laid out on the table. This devotion to meat even had a medical justification. According to medieval health theories, foods carried certain qualities. Meat was considered hot and moist, which supposedly suited active and noble bodies. Vegetables were thought cold and dry, making them more appropriate for laborers. Royal physicians even prescribed specific meats for various illnesses, recommending venison for fever, pork for strength, and fowl to sharpen the mind. Of course, none of these ideas had any real scientific basis, but they helped justify noble indulgence. Still, meat alone would have been dull without one essential ingredient that truly elevated noble dining. Spices were the crown jewels of medieval cuisine. These fragrant powders and dried fruits, seeds, and roots transformed simple dishes into dazzling expressions of wealth. If nobles had social media, every feast would have been tagged spice goals. Getting these flavors to Europe was no small task. Pepper came only from India, cinnamon from distant islands, and nutmeg and cloves from the far reaches of Indonesia. They passed through countless hands, carried by ship, camel, and horse across deserts and seas before reaching Europe. Each stop along the journey inflated the cost until spices were worth their weight in precious metals. Historical records show that a single pound of ginger could cost the same as a sheep, while nutmeg might equal 7 oxen in value. Cloves fetched prices that would be hundreds of dollars per pound today. The most prized of all was saffron, sometimes valued higher than gold itself, since it took around 75,000 flowers to produce just 1 pound. Entire cities prospered from the spice trade. Venice, once a swampy island town, grew rich and powerful by controlling trade routes between east and west. Spice merchants amassed incredible fortunes, building palaces of their own, and even lending money to kings. They were the original luxury traders, selling products that were both delicious and status symbols. The noble fascination with spices bordered on obsession. Surviving cookbooks reveal dishes overflowing with seasonings. One recipe for chicken demanded 6 different spices along with 3 kinds of sugar. A royal fish dish called for 23 distinct spices in a single serving. It seems medieval diners had stronger taste buds than modern ones. Color mattered too. The wealthy wanted food that looked as extravagant as it tasted. Saffron turned ordinary meals into gleaming gold masterpieces, a final touch of luxury for those who dined not out of hunger, but to show the world how much they could afford. Sandalwood turned sauces into bright shades of red. Some daring cooks even crushed azure stones to create blue-colored meals. That is right, medieval aristocrats literally consumed powdered gemstones just to impress their guests with strikingly colored dishes. Would these intensely spiced foods appeal to us today? Probably not. Medieval recipes blended flavors that would taste strange to modern palates. Cinnamon appeared in fish dishes, pepper was sprinkled on fruit, and ginger seemed to go with everything. But good flavor was never the main point. The purpose was to display wealth and influence. The more spices you could afford to add, the higher your status appeared. Spices became such clear indicators of rank that rulers eventually passed laws limiting who could use them. In some places, commoners caught with saffron faced heavy fines. Certain seasonings were legally restricted for noble families only. Inspectors would sometimes raid homes in search of hidden spice supplies. Medieval spice patrols were surprisingly real. Protecting these rare ingredients required serious precautions. Great castles kept special locked storage rooms for spices, with guards stationed nearby. Many noble households even hired spice masters, whose entire duty was to safeguard and measure these costly ingredients. These trusted professionals carried private keys and guarded secret formulas for blending flavors. Although these exotic spices drained royal treasuries and dominated upper-class dining, they represented only one part of the extravagant food system that divided the privileged from everyone else. The next essential marker of wealth appeared in a much simpler form. Bread was more than food during the medieval period. It was a visible symbol of status that instantly revealed your social class. Medieval bread served as the original edible ID card. The finest type, known as manch, was reserved for the upper classes. Made from pure wheat flour that had been sifted several times through linen cloths, manch was valued for its pale white color. Each stage of sifting removed bran and germ, wasting around a third of the grain. The wealthy literally threw away nourishment just to make their bread appear cleaner and whiter. It was medieval luxury at its most ridiculous. Lords received soft white manch loaves, while servants ate darker, cheaper bread. Court bakers followed precise rules about which kind of bread each person was entitled to. Ignoring those bread laws could lead to punishment. Bread was serious business. The rising middle class commonly ate maslin, a blend of wheat and rye that baked into a light brown loaf. Maslin cost less than manch, but still carried respectability. It was the medieval version of owning a reliable mid-range carriage. Not glamorous, yet comfortable enough to maintain dignity. Poorer people relied on dense, dark loaves bulked up with fillers. In hard times, peasants stretched their flour by mixing in peas, beans, acorns, or even sawdust. During severe famine, some resorted to grinding tree bark into their dough. These heavy loaves could even be dangerous. Rye bread often developed ergot fungus, which caused sickness, hallucinations, or death. Nothing expressed suffering like bread that could either poison you or make you think dragons were real. A clever use of bread appeared in the form of the trencher, a thick slab of stale bread that acted as a plate for meats and sauces. After the meal, nobles passed these soaked trenchers to servants or beggars waiting nearby. It was medieval-style recycling. The nobles disposed of leftovers while appearing charitable. Royal kitchens devoured massive quantities of bread. Some great feasts required over 6,000 loaves of varying types. Large estates employed teams of bakers who worked in shifts around ovens that almost never cooled. In certain manors, the cost of bread exceeded the entire payroll of the household guards. While bread showed where you stood in the social order, the final course of a noble meal demonstrated true extravagance. Sugar was the ultimate status symbol of the medieval dining table. When it first appeared in Europe, it was considered closer to a luxury gem than to food itself. If a noble offered you something sweet, it was not a gesture of kindness. It was a way of declaring wealth and power, because sugar cost more than most people's homes. Bringing it to European tables required enormous effort and expense. Sugarcane grew in distant tropical lands, and refining it demanded endless hours of exhausting labor. Workers harvested the tall stalks, crushed them to extract juice, boiled the liquid, and purified it through several careful stages. The finished sugar arrived in solid cone-shaped blocks, so hard they had to be shattered with hammers or knives before use. Medieval sugar was so tough that in an emergency, you could probably swing it like a weapon. Just how costly was it? Historical records reveal that a single pound of sugar cost nearly the same as a skilled craftsman's entire week of wages. In today's money, that would equal paying hundreds of dollars for one small bag of sugar. Ordinary people used honey to sweeten their food, but at an aristocratic banquet, serving honey would have been considered terribly improper. The desserts that wealthy diners enjoyed were extravagant beyond belief. They feasted on marzipan, molded into animals and castles, fruit jellies thickened with gelatin from animal hooves, and thin wafers pressed with beautiful patterns. The rich were essentially dining on edible artwork, while peasants struggled to find their next meal. The showpiece of these sugar feasts was something called a subtlety. These elaborate sugar sculptures appeared between courses, serving as both decoration and performance. A subtlety could take the form of a detailed castle, a mythological creature, or even a mechanical scene that moved as servants carried it in. These creations were edible masterpieces filled with political meaning or flattery toward powerful guests. In modern terms, they were like those viral online desserts that look too perfect to eat, except each one cost more than a farmer's yearly income. Candied fruits and nuts were popular luxuries as well. Imported oranges, lemons, and dates were boiled in sugar syrup to create glossy preserves enjoyed through every season. Comfits, tiny sugar-coated seeds or spices, served as both breath fresheners and status symbols, packaged in decorative boxes that cost more than the sweets inside them. Sugar was not only a luxury treat, but also considered medicine. Physicians at royal courts prescribed it to treat a variety of illnesses. In other words, medieval doctors were handing out candy as medical advice, which probably explains why so many patients came back complaining about their teeth. Serving sweets was a ritual in itself. The final course of a feast was called the void, when desserts appeared on ornate trays carried by special attendants, often accompanied by live music. Small decorative sticks and delicate two-pronged forks allowed nobles to taste sticky candies without dirtying their fingers. Naturally, all these sugary dishes left diners thirsty for something to drink. Nobles refused to touch plain water since most water sources were polluted and often caused disease. In their view, drinking water was about as appealing as chewing on weeds. Wine became the universal drink of choice for the upper classes. The finest varieties came from the vineyards of France and Germany and were imported at enormous expense. Records show some noble families spent nearly one-fifth of their entire household budget just to maintain their wine supply. Their cellars were essentially treasure vaults filled with barrels instead of gold coins. The amount of alcohol consumed daily was astonishing. Documents from noble courts reveal that 1 gallon of wine per person was considered a normal day's allowance. That equals roughly 8 modern bottles of wine every single day. Morning wine, midday wine, and evening wine were all expected parts of the routine. This did not make nobles alcoholics by their standards. They saw themselves as sophisticated wine lovers with refined drinking habits. Beyond regular wine, the elite also enjoyed spiced varieties such as hippocras, which blended wine with sugar, ginger, and cinnamon. Mead, made from fermented honey, appeared at special feasts, while beer was looked down upon as a commoner's drink. Offering beer to a nobleman would have been an embarrassing mistake, much like bringing cheap boxed wine to an elegant dinner today. Technically still alcohol, but socially unacceptable. Even the vessels used for drinking reflected status. The wealthy sipped from silver or golden goblets, often adorned with precious stones. Some owned wooden mazers with metal rims, while others preferred ceremonial drinking horns decorated with fine engravings. The more elaborate the cup, the higher the owner's prestige. Wine tasting already existed, managed by professional stewards whose duty was to sample every drink before service. They checked for spoilage and, more importantly, for poison. Being a wine taster in medieval times demanded great courage or a remarkable lack of self-preservation. Many castles contained clever wine delivery systems, with real pipes running through their walls that carried wine straight from the cellar to the dining hall. These medieval drink taps meant nobles never had to wait for their goblets to be filled. They essentially created the world's first drink dispensers, proving that people will always find creative ways to avoid getting up for a refill. While nobles enjoyed their endless supply of wine, they also searched for foods that ordinary people could never dream of tasting. Medieval aristocrats took great pride in eating things that no one else could afford, or even imagine eating. The rarer and pricier the dish, the more it proved their importance. Wealthy diners in those times would consume almost anything as long as it was rare and outrageously expensive. Their banquets resembled luxury versions of reality show challenges. Whale meat stood out among the strangest dishes served to the elite. In many kingdoms, any whale that washed ashore automatically became royal property. The tongue was considered the finest part and was always reserved for the highest-ranking guest. Cooks salted the blubber for preservation and roasted or stewed the meat into extravagant dishes. Nothing announced prestige quite like eating a massive sea creature that could sink an entire fishing fleet. Other sea mammals, such as porpoises and dolphins, also graced noble tables. Religious authorities allowed these animals to be eaten on fasting days, since they lived in water, even though they breathed air. Castle records show that porpoise meat cost nearly 40 times more than ordinary fish. When nobles claimed to be fasting, what they really meant was that they were eating dolphins instead of venison. True spiritual discipline. Medieval food rules were filled with loopholes, rivaling the complexity of tax codes. Small birds were another aristocratic favorite. Larks, thrushes, and finches were caught, roasted, and served by the dozen. Feasting on such tiny birds displayed wealth, since catching enough for a single meal required hours of labor. Some recipes demanded as many as 60 birds per dish. Imagine a servant spending the entire day hunting little birds so their master could take a few bites from each. It was terrible job security, but excellent exercise. Among the strangest delicacies was the barnacle goose. These geese lived so far north that few people ever saw them nest or lay eggs. This mystery led to a bizarre belief that the birds grew out of barnacles clinging to driftwood. Because of this mistaken idea, nobles were allowed to eat barnacle geese during religious fasts when meat was forbidden. It became a convenient culinary loophole. If you could invent a story linking your food to fish, you could enjoy it on Fridays. This is why no one trusted a hungry noble with an active imagination. Even ice counted as a luxury in the medieval world. Wealthy households built underground chambers where blocks of winter ice were stored under straw to last through the summer. Guests marveled at chilled drinks and frozen desserts. Nobles did not invent refrigeration to preserve food or medicine, but simply to avoid drinking warm wine which they considered unbearable. Imported foods also symbolized status. Rice traveled from the distant east, citrus fruits arrived from the Mediterranean, and dates, figs, and pomegranates were carried north across deserts and seas. By the time they reached castle tables, these fruits were often so overripe that only the truly rich could afford the dental damage from eating them. Common vegetables, on the other hand, were rejected by the upper classes. Turnips, carrots, and other root crops were considered food for peasants. Nobles who ate them risked being mocked for having poor taste. Medieval aristocrats were the original picky eaters, snubbing perfectly good vegetables, while happily feasting on whale fat and barnacle birds. Some of the most prized foods were thought to possess magical or healing properties. The so-called unicorn horn, actually the tusk of a narwhal, was ground into powder and consumed by the wealthy as a supposed cure for illness. Ambergris, a waxy material produced in the stomachs of whales, was used to flavor fine dishes, despite its strange and unpleasant source. Yes, the richest nobles willingly spent fortunes to eat whale vomit and narwhal tusk powder, while looking down on peasants for their simple diets. Through these bizarre and extravagant dining habits, the upper class drew a clear line between themselves and everyone else. Their meals were not just about flavor. They were performances of power that communicated social rank without a single word spoken.